What up, Pittsburgh Steelers fans? Matty P here with another episode of Steelers Warm, the show that tries to put you in the minds of Omar Khan, Mike Tomlin, and Andy Weidel as they put together a winning roster in 2024 and hopefully beyond, and hopefully a roster that can compete for a 7th Lombardi trophy. All right, today we're talking a quick video. All this talk around Brandon Aiyuk. I just thought, let's talk about Brandon Aiyuk. Let's talk about how he compares to some other guys that technically could be available this offseason as well. Just a super quick comparison video, something to think about as all this discussion, all this trade bait goes on. I'm more of the opinion that I would like the Steelers to go get young guys at wide receiver, get cheaper guys. I don't want them to trade high picks. But Stephon Diggs left the Bills for a 2024 6th rounder and a 2025 5th rounder. However, Diggs was very, very expensive on the cap, so that the teams have to absorb that cost. It's an opportunity cost in many ways. Thought it'd be cool. We're going to compare Brandon Aiyuk to Courtland Sutton and T. Higgins, and also give you some insight on how they compared to Deontay Johnson in terms of their overall production. And then we can try and work out what the value is from a trade perspective. So we're going to use Pro Football Reference's StatHead tool. This is a paid-for tool. We're just going to promote StatHead there when they don't sponsor us. I wish they did. But it's really, really helpful tool if you want to pay for it. It's pretty cheap per year, pretty cheap monthly fee as well. But really, really helpful. Well, we do a lot of stuff on the channel with it. All right, so if you look at these three guys, Courtland Sutton, Brandon Aiyuk, T. Higgins. Courtland Sutton has played the most games by far in the NFL, but he's also played 2 more seasons. Both T. Higgins and Brandon Aiyuk came out in the 2020 draft. Courtland Sutton came in 2018. Now, Deontay Johnson, for perspective, also came in 2019. Games in terms of play, obviously, so that's why Courtland Sutton's got 81, whereas T. Higgins and Brandon Aiyuk are very similar in 58 and 62. Now, obviously, Brandon Aiyuk's coming to the end of his rookie contract, whereas T. Higgins is on a transition tag. Therefore, if you go get Brandon Aiyuk, he will want a new deal, whereas T. Higgins will also want a new deal, but you do have him on the tag this year as well. So you look at the AV, a lot of people might not be familiar with AV. That's the approximate value. That's the rating that Pro Football Reference give to a player at their position based on production, and it is weighted. Brandon Aiyuk by far has the most out of these three guys, including Courtland Sutton, even though Sutton's played almost 20 games more. Receptions, Courtland Sutton leads that, but if you particularly narrow in on Higgins and Brandon Aiyuk, Aiyuk, from the draft class of 2020, Aiyuk has more productions by 12, not huge amount. If you look at yards, Brandon Aiyuk again is ahead there. Higgins to Aiyuk with about 270 odd yards. Courtland Sutton's ahead of Brandon Aiyuk by about 300 yards, but again, look at the more games he's played. Yards per reception, they're all super similar, like George Pickens style numbers out of college, 14.3, 14.6, 14.3, so really similar. Reception TDs, all of them have a minimum of 24 TDs. Brandon Aiyuk has 25. That's from a reception TDs perspective. Obviously, rushing TDs, Brandon Aiyuk has a couple of them as well from some experimental stuff that they've done at times over at San Francisco. But rush attempts is like no one's had more than 13 rush attempts. Brandon Aiyuk leads that. Brandon Aiyuk has an All-Pro, and Courtland Sutton has a Pro Bowl. Only other real stats before I start talking about trade value and all those sorts of things that I did think was interesting is when I went into the advanced receiving. So I actually like when you look at it, it's really interesting in terms of the fact that Brandon Aiyuk and Courtland Sutton breaks more tackles. He has 19 more broken tackles in his NFL career. I think Brandon Aiyuk is on like 16. And you actually look at yards per broken, receptions per broken tackle. Courtland Sutton's in the low 14s, Brandon Aiyuk's in the high 14s. So kind of interesting. And you're kind of wondering with Courtland Sutton, why am I bringing him into the mix? Well, Courtland Sutton didn't rock up to the off-season workouts with Denver. He wants to look at a new deal. He also has a very good relationship with Russell Wilson. Really good relationship. He was one of the guys that Russell Wilson called out as being really thankful for in leaving Denver. He's a good player. He's a combat catcher. Now, not necessarily does all the blocking things that Brandon Aiyuk does, but he's a guy on the outside, and this would allow the Steelers to potentially, if you use a later pick, to go get a Malachi Corley, a Deebo Samuel 2.0. You've got Courtland Sutton. You've got T. Higgins. We know you've got George Pickens, not T. Higgins. You've got George Pickens, who, when he wants to block, can block. They've got some other guys who are into mixing, like Cordell Patterson, that can play wide receiver, running back. can be like a very much a blocking wide receiver if he wants to be. He's capable of that. He's got the body type. There's other guys they can look at as well. As teams draft guys, they're going to release guys. There may be wide receivers that come available. But that's where Courtland Sutton is. Courtland Sutton is a very interesting name to throw into this mix. With T. Higgins, the Bengals are really going to shoot for another. They're shooting for another Super Bowl with Joe Burrow back. They, know they're going to have to page Marchese. This is from an offensive perspective. Before it's really on fully on Burrow's shoulders, they need Higgins, and they're probably unlikely to trade into a division rival. Or the cost is going to be like first, second round draft picks, cost that the Steelers A, probably don't want to give, and B, really can't afford to give because we need to bring young bona fide talent into this team to get it ready for our own Super Bowl chase over the next few seasons. The other thing that I thought was interesting is when I compared the four blokes, I brought in Deontay Johnson. Deontay had less games than Courtland Sutton. He had the most receptions by far. He was used a lot, remember, when he came into the league in 2019 by Mason Rudolph, who was pretty much like almost like a lone wolf out there at wide receiver from a production standpoint. And Ben loved Deontay as well. They had a really good relationship. If you look at that, from Deontay Johnson's perspective, literally he's ahead in everything overall because he's had a longer career than two of the guys in Brandon Aiyuk and T. Higgins. But if you look at him yards per reception, he's a lot lower than these guys. But he's a different style of player in terms of it's speedy, it's route running, it's twitchy, it's all about release. Whereas these other guys are guys who are going to go get the football for you, are going to get into catching traffic, are going to make breakaway speed, are going to break tackles, all those good things. So it is really interesting when you think about what the Steelers are trying to do. Now, you might also say with George Pickens, that's very similar to a T. Higgins and a Courtland Sutton. Brandon Aiyuk offers something a bit different, not just the fact that he looks literally like Mike Tomlin's kid. But they do offer those things similar to Pickens, but also that takes pressure off Pickens. As I say, then it allows you to go get a Deebo Samuel type in a Malachi Corley, for example, or trade potentially even with the Chiefs with it for a super late pick and go get Sky Moore, who's not really worked out, who my Global Perspective co-host on this channel, Shannon White, loves. There's just some different options you can do when it comes to looking at this. But if we look at trade value with Brandon Aiyuk, don't get me wrong, he's been a great addition to this team. But what's he worth to San Francisco? And obviously we know as this stretches out, particularly gets into closer to the draft over the next week or so, and I might finish this show and they've already landed the bloke. But the compensation that you've got to give the 49ers is going to decrease. But if it's a low for Aiyuk and the Bills could be in for Aiyuk, I've had other teams where it makes sense where they're try and go after him. It kind of makes sense for Courtland Sutton because if you're trading a fourth, let's say for Brandon Aiyuk, you can probably trade a fifth for Courtland Sutton, I should say, sorry, and maybe something in the future as well. Just wanted to bring that thought to you guys, all Steeler Nation. Do you want Brandon Aiyuk? Do you want Courtland Sutton? Would you prefer T. Higgins if we could somehow make that work? You let me know in the comments. I'm Matty P. As always, go Steelers.